Marina Taylor had never been the kind of woman who needed noise or distraction to feel alive. Her world had been built on discipline, structure, and control, qualities she sharpened over years of running a logistics firm from the ground up. At 42, recently divorced and emotionally spent, she wasn't interested in another corporate battle or an urban skyline view from a rented penthouse. She wanted peace, the kind of peace that didn't require negotiation. So when her divorce was finalized and her ex-husband conceded the lake house, more out of indifference than kindness, Marina didn't hesitate. She packed her life into a few boxes, shipped her remaining office belongings to a storage unit in Denver, and drove north until the city vanished in the rearview mirror. The house, tucked deep into a quiet, wooded community around a man-made lake, wasn't glamorous by conventional standards. It had aging cedar siding, a tilted mailbox, and an overgrown slope that rolled down into a quiet stretch of water that shimmered like brushed steel in the morning light. But it was hers. Legally, emotionally, and geographically, it was hers in every way that mattered. The land stretched from her front porch to the rocky waterline and then extended 38 feet into the lake, giving her access to a small, weathered dock and a floating platform that her ex-husband had used, perhaps once, for drinking beer with. Old college buddies. Now it was a relic from another life, one that Marina had no desire to mourn. The first morning she woke up in the house was almost suspiciously silent. No horns, no sirens, no neighbor's dog barking through thin apartment walls. Just the soft creak of floorboards adjusting to her movement and the occasional chirp of birds outside the kitchen window. She made coffee and sat on the back deck, staring at the stillness of the lake. The surface barely rippled, save for a few distant ducks paddling along the far shore. For the first time in what felt like years, her shoulders didn't ache with stress. She felt possibility in the air. That same afternoon, she ordered a jet ski. Not impulsively, she had wanted one for years, but practically, deliberately. It was a reward, and also a reminder that she could claim space, move freely, and enjoy the life she had earned. A week later, it arrived, slick and silver, humming with restrained energy. The dock had to be reinforced, but Marina hired a licensed contractor, followed the code requirements, filed the right permits, and ensured everything was on the books. It was how she operated. Legal clarity above all. The first ride was exhilarating. She rode fast, carving gentle arcs across her section of the water, careful to avoid the middle channel where fishing boats usually loitered. The wind tangled in her hair, and for the first time in years she smiled without prompting. She didn't race around recklessly or create a spectacle. She was measured, respectful, but entirely unburdened. That evening, she rinsed down the machine, secured it to the dock, and turned in early with the kind of restful sleep that eludes most people navigating the ruins of a broken marriage. It wasn't until the following morning that the tone shifted. There was a folded piece of paper taped to her front door, placed carefully with blue painter's tape. Notice: motorized watercraft is prohibited. It read in bold, blocky font. Beneath that, all lake usage is subject to community guidelines. Non-compliance will result in escalating penalties. No logo, no contact name, no official header. Just a paper threat, devoid of accountability. Marina stared at it, confused more than concerned. She reread the deed she had reviewed a dozen times before. It clearly stated that her lot included water access and that she owned the adjacent lake frontage to a depth of no more than 40 linear feet. There had been no mention of restrictions, at least none imposed on her lot independently. Marina took the notice inside, placed it beside her coffee mug, and called the local property records office. She confirmed once again that the lake, though man-made, was not under state jurisdiction. It was maintained by a property owner's council, what some might call a homeowners association, though the term was never formally used in her documents. The representative on the phone explained that while general guidelines did exist, enforcement required direct community participation and specific legal authority. Marina hung up with a dry, "Thank you," and began looking through the welcome package she had received when she first took possession of the property. Tucked among pamphlets about waste collection and fire safety was a vague sheet titled Community Water Conduct Guidelines, handwritten and copied, outlining recommendations against disruptive noise, excessive wake, and use of personal watercraft during dusk hours. Nowhere did it say prohibited. Nowhere did it mention any penalties, much less enforcement. It read more like a passive-aggressive neighborhood flyer than policy. She didn't think much more of it until later that week, when she returned from running errands to find a woman standing near her dock. Dressed in a pressed linen blouse and stone-colored slacks, the woman had the stiff posture of someone who had never been told no. She turned when she heard Marina approach. "You must be Marina," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Elaine Bell. I live 2 houses down. I've been meaning to introduce myself." Marina extended a hand, but Elaine made no move to take it. Instead, she turned toward the lake. "Lovely view, isn't it? Very lively these days." Marina kept her tone neutral. "Yes, it is." Elaine's gaze sharpened. "The jet ski. I assume that's yours." "It is," Marina replied. "It's on my property." Elaine let out a soft, exasperated laugh. "Well, that's the issue. You see, our lake isn't zoned for motorized vehicles. There's a history of erosion, and several residents have expressed concerns about the impact on shoreline stability, not to mention the wildlife." Marina frowned. "My property line includes the dock and 40 feet into the water. I've reviewed the documents. There's nothing illegal about my jet ski." Elaine tilted her head slightly as if assessing a child who had just mispronounced a word. "It's not always about what's written. It's about the tone you set, the message. This is a peaceful community. We all give a little to keep it that way." Her voice was calm, but beneath it simmered expectation. Marina offered a tight smile. "Then I suggest you speak with the people using leaf blowers at 7 a.m., or the couple with outdoor karaoke on Fridays, because I've been silent all week, except for 20 minutes of water time, in the daylight, on my side of the lake." Elaine's expression didn't shift, but her voice dropped. "Some of us have been here long enough to understand that the rules only work when everyone respects the balance. I'm sure you'll come to see that too." With that, she turned and walked back up the slope toward her meticulously trimmed lawn. Marina watched her go, uneasy now not because of any legal threat, but because of the certainty in Elaine's tone, the unspoken promise that if Marina didn't conform, she'd be made to. It wasn't the notice that unnerved her. It was the smile, the assumption that she'd fold. Later that night, as the wind whistled through the trees and the lake darkened into quiet ink, Marina stared at the water from her window. She saw no boats, no figures, but the stillness didn't comfort her like before. It felt watched. Not in a paranoid way. Marina was far too grounded for that. But something had shifted. The lake wasn't just hers anymore. It was a stage, and someone else thought they were the director. And Marina. She wasn't auditioning for anyone's production. The notice reappeared 3 days later. This time, it wasn't a sheet of paper taped to her front door with painter's tape. It was a typed envelope, hand-delivered and slipped into her mailbox without a stamp. Marina opened it slowly, unfolding the thick sheet of stationery with the emblem of the Lakeview Community Council embossed at the top. The language was slightly more formal than the first attempt, but just as vague. "Dear resident," it began, without addressing her by name. "We are reaching out to remind you that personal watercraft use on Lakeview waters is governed by a shared agreement to maintain ecological harmony and resident well-being." It has come to our attention that activities associated with your residence may not align with the collective expectations of the community. We strongly encourage voluntary cessation of powered lake equipment until this matter can be resolved through the proper channels. Marina read the entire letter twice, then set it down on her kitchen table with a sigh. There were no legal citations, no mention of actual rules, just euphemistic pressure and passive threats. What struck her wasn't the attempt to intimidate, it was the word voluntary. As if, by not complying, she'd be violating a social contract she had never agreed to. That evening, she called her attorney. Tessa was a friend from Marina's corporate years, now semi-retired and selective about which cases she took. But when Marina forwarded the letter and asked for her opinion, Tessa's response came in under 2 minutes. There's nothing binding in that language. They're testing you. Want me to send something preemptive? Marina replied that she'd hold off for now but would keep her updated. She didn't want this to escalate too fast. At least not until she understood what kind of game was being played. The next day, Marina made copies of her property deed, the lake frontage map, and the zoning documentation she had filed when reinforcing her dock. She walked the short incline to the council office, a converted boathouse painted cream with hunter green trim, and asked to speak with whoever had authored the letter. The receptionist, a young man in his 20s with clear discomfort in his eyes, disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a middle-aged man in a collared golf shirt tucked a little too tightly into khaki pants. "Hello," he said, extending a hand. "Russell Fay, Lakeview Communications Liaison." Marina took his hand firmly, then handed him the folder. "I received this letter," she said calmly, "and I want to clarify that I'm in full legal compliance with my property's zoning. These documents confirm that." Russell took the folder but didn't open it. He offered a practiced smile. "I'm sure you are, Ms. Taylor. We're not accusing you of wrongdoing, just encouraging awareness. Lakeview is a cooperative environment. We depend on mutual respect." Marina met his gaze without blinking. "You're sending unsigned, non-binding letters to individuals with titled rights. That's not cooperation. That's pressure without process." Russell's smile faltered slightly. "It's an evolving conversation. The water rights issue is something our board has been discussing. The lake's use has changed over the years." "My rights haven't," Marina said. "Unless the zoning board reclassifies this lake or you pass an enforceable ordinance, I suggest you stop mailing suggestions disguised as governance." She left before he could reply, feeling a flicker of satisfaction but also a growing sense that this wasn't over. The next few days were uneventful. No letters, no confrontations, but something had shifted in the neighborhood. The woman who usually jogged past Marina's driveway didn't nod like she used to. "Oh." A couple, walking their golden retriever, glanced at her jet ski and whispered, not even pretending to be discreet. One evening, Marina noticed a pickup truck parked 2 houses down, its engine idling, the driver watching her dock for nearly 10 minutes before pulling away. No confrontation. No escalation. Just visibility. She understood now that the strategy wasn't to stop her directly. It was to isolate her, slowly erode her comfort until she complied voluntarily. But Marina didn't do voluntary compliance when it came to property rights. Still, she wasn't reckless either. She sent her documentation to Tessa for record-keeping and began logging everything: dates, times, strange cars, conversations. Not because she felt paranoid, but because she knew what preparation looked like. The next act of aggression came not as a confrontation, but as sabotage. It was early morning when she walked down to the dock, coffee mug in hand, and saw the slick glisten of gasoline on the water's surface. Her jet ski was tilted slightly, one of the ties unlooped, the rear end low in the water. She cursed under her breath, dropped the mug, and ran to check the engine. The fuel cap had been twisted off. Inside the hull, The fuel line had been cleanly sliced, leaving the smell of petroleum thick in the air. Someone had deliberately vandalized her property, not just as a message, but as an act of destruction. Marina didn't panic. She photographed everything, every angle, every detail, and immediately called the sheriff's department. While she waited for a deputy to arrive, she reviewed her exterior camera footage. The dock itself wasn't visible. She hadn't positioned the camera that far down, but the side gate and backyard were. Around 2:43 a.m., a figure entered from the south edge, wearing dark clothes and moving quietly. They didn't approach the house or look at the cameras, which suggested familiarity with the angles. They disappeared from frame near the water line, then reappeared 15 minutes later, walking calmly back the way they came. When the deputy arrived, Marina walked him through what she had found, showed him the video, and submitted a formal incident report. The deputy, to his credit, was thorough and respectful. "We've had a few complaints about vandalism near the West Docks," he said. "Not a pattern yet, but you're not the first to report something strange." Marina asked if the association had reported anything. He paused. "No. But sometimes people handle things privately. We'll open a case. If you get any more communication, keep it." She thanked him and watched as he drove off, feeling not fear, but focus. Whoever had done this was counting on her to be reactive. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she called her insurance company, filed a claim, then scheduled a technician to assess the damage and provide a written estimate for repairs. She also called Tessa and filled her in, forwarding the footage and police report. Tessa didn't mince words. "It's sabotage. Period. Don't respond emotionally. This is documentation phase. Let's play the long game." Marina agreed, and that night she adjusted her security cameras to cover more of the lower slope, installed motion-sensitive lights near the dock, and locked the jet ski in place with a new chain and alarm tether. She didn't cancel her next ride. She just waited 2 days for repairs to be completed. On the following Saturday, under a pale, cloudless sky, Marina rode again. Not across the lake, but in a small, tight loop within her own boundary. Her presence was deliberate, visible. She was stating, without words, that intimidation wouldn't work. That same afternoon, a new letter arrived. This one was bolder, printed on letterhead, signed by someone claiming to be the environmental safety officer of the community. It stated that Marina's use of a personal watercraft posed potential ecological threats to native aquatic species, and that pending a comprehensive shoreline stability assessment, she was advised to suspend all powered activity on the lake immediately. This wasn't a legal order. It was, again, a suggestion phrased to sound authoritative. But Marina wasn't the same homeowner she had been 2 weeks ago. She scanned the letter, noted the fabricated title, and forwarded it to both her lawyer and the sheriff's department. The community wasn't just leaning on etiquette anymore, it was manufacturing bureaucracy. That was the real threat. Not Elaine, not Russell, but the willingness to blur legality into suggestion, hoping the average person would blink first. Marina didn't blink. She documented, she fortified, and she waited, because someone was about to overstep, and when they did, she'd be ready. Marina wasn't naive enough to think that compliance was the goal. From the moment the first notice was left on her door, she knew that this was not about jet skis or water turbulence or nesting birds. It was about control, an invisible line that certain people in communities like this drew around themselves, defining who belonged and who didn't, and, more importantly, who got to decide the rules. Her presence challenged that. Her refusal to quietly assimilate to expectations she never agreed to disturbed a pattern they had likely enforced for years. The signs of escalation were subtle at first. Unreturned waves from neighbors who had previously smiled, a landscaping crew suddenly showing up 2 hours early to blow leaves into the slope by her dock, and a strange delay in her recycling pickup that mysteriously resolved itself the moment she called the city to inquire. Oh, nothing overt, nothing she could pin down. But the feeling was unmistakable. They were testing her thresholds, what she would report, what she would tolerate, and what she might begin to question in herself. The next move, however, abandoned ambiguity entirely. One morning, just before 8, Marina opened her email to find a digital copy of a community hearing request form submitted in her name, with a scanned signature at the bottom that looked vaguely like hers, but was not. It claimed she was voluntarily requesting a hearing regarding her non-compliance with unified shoreline regulations, citing a desire to resolve the matter amicably in the spirit of neighborhood cohesion. She stared at the email for a long moment, before scrolling to the sender, an account labeled clerkalakeview.council.net, a domain she hadn't seen before. The message thanked her for her cooperation and said that the hearing would be scheduled the following week, subject to quorum availability. Marina immediately forwarded the email to Tessa, attached a high-resolution image of her actual signature, and added one line. "I did not submit this." Within the hour, Tessa responded bluntly. "This is identity misrepresentation. We'll draft a cease and desist." Then, without prompting, she added, "I've seen this tactic before in HOA cases. They'll pretend you're participating to make it look collaborative. Then they use that record to justify action. It's legally shaky, but they count on people not challenging it fast enough." Marina didn't wait. She printed out the email, drove down to the small municipal records office 2 towns over where zoning issues were formally processed, and spoke directly to a clerk named Harris, a man in his 60s with a calm voice and a meticulous approach to file handling. He confirmed that the domain used in the email was not registered with any government-affiliated departments and that the hearing request had not yet been entered into their official system, which meant no legal proceedings had been formally launched yet. That afternoon, Marina and Tessa filed an official notarized letter with the county, stating that any document bearing Marina's signature must be verified through her legal counsel and that no hearing had been authorized or requested. They also submitted a complaint to the State Bar Association citing possible unauthorized legal representation under a fabricated entity. The move was both defensive and preemptive. It placed the burden of legitimacy squarely on those who had initiated the forgery. But things only accelerated from there. The following weekend, as Marina prepared to host 2 friends from out of town for a quiet evening by the lake, she noticed a group of people standing across the water on the opposite bank. There were 6 of them, dressed casually, some holding clipboards, others with binoculars. At first, she thought they were birdwatchers or part of a hiking group, but when she brought her own binoculars to get a better look, she saw that they weren't observing the sky or the trees. They were pointing, gesturing, and clearly discussing something about her property. One of them had a drone in hand. Within minutes, the small buzzing craft lifted into the air and began making slow arcs above her dock and the slope leading down from her house. Marina watched, her jaw clenched, heart pounding not from fear, but from fury. There had been no notice, no courtesy request, nothing. This was surveillance, or worse, data collection for an unsanctioned report. She pulled out her phone, recorded the drone's flight, and then called the sheriff's office again. This time, she was less reserved. The dispatcher connected her with a deputy who agreed to send someone to speak to the group, and within 20 minutes, a cruiser arrived on the opposite shore. The drone came down quickly. The group dispersed. But the message was clear. They were documenting her. Tessa called later that evening with more unsettling news. "I did a domain trace on that email server," she said, her voice unusually tight. "It's hosted offshore. That's not typical. Somebody's going to great lengths to make this look legitimate while staying out of formal scrutiny. You're dealing with something that's layered. informal pressure backed by staged formality. They're building a case in the shadows so that if it ever goes public, it looks like due process was followed. Marina felt a weight settle in her stomach. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble. This was institutionalized exclusion wrapped in polite language and obscure process. She decided to expand her defenses. The next day, she hired an independent environmental consultant, someone certified and regionally respected, to inspect her dock and its impact on the shoreline. She paid up front for a full review, including soil stability, water clarity, wake assessment, and noise levels. The consultant, Dr. Kale Nguyen, conducted a 2-day evaluation and concluded in his preliminary report that Marina's usage fell well within safe and legal parameters and posed no demonstrable impact to the immediate or extended ecosystem beyond naturally occurring variance. It was a bulletproof statement, written by a professional whose credibility exceeded any local council's amateur guidelines. Marina scanned the document, printed multiple copies, and delivered one by registered mail to the Lakeview Council office, addressed directly to Russell Fay. She also sent a digital copy to the Sheriff's Department just to keep the authorities informed. She wanted them to know that she wasn't merely responding, she was building. But her boldness only provoked new tactics. The following week, while walking the perimeter of her lot, Marina noticed something odd. The buoy she had placed to demarcate her legal water boundary had been moved, dragged approximately 15 feet toward the shoreline, subtly reducing the area of water she appeared to control. At first glance, it was nothing. A drifting object, easily explained by current or wind. But Marina had secured the buoy with an anchored line and GPS coordinates logged at installation. When she checked the marker's position, it confirmed her suspicion. Someone had entered the water and deliberately altered the boundary. It was subtle, insidious, and hard to prove as malicious. But to Marina, it was a line crossed. She photographed the new location, compared it with her installation data, and added it to her growing file. That night she received an anonymous voicemail. No voice, no message, just 40 seconds of lapping water and what sounded like footsteps on a wooden dock. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m. This was no longer about suggesting. They were trespassing, manipulating, erasing. Marina installed additional security lighting facing the water, invested in underwater cameras, and purchased a motion-activated siren. The next time someone approached her dock uninvited, they would be seen, recorded, and hopefully deterred. She wasn't seeking confrontation, but she was done absorbing offense. She informed Tessa of every measure and forwarded every data point. When the next formal complaint arrived, this time an envelope marked Urgent Violation Notice Enclosed, she didn't hesitate. Inside was a printed declaration that her buoy's placement constituted willful boundary extension, accompanied by a threat of fines and lake access revocation. The document referenced the very GPS coordinates she had originally submitted with her installation report, but distorted them. They had taken her data and repurposed it against her. Marina's response was swift. Through Tessa, she issued a formal demand for retraction, citing data tampering, and requested that any further communication be directed to her legal representative. She enclosed a notarized statement from her environmental consultant and provided time-stamped photos of the buoy before and after the movement. The document closed with a warning. Any additional attempt to misrepresent boundaries or falsify official data will be met with litigation. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was tension withheld. Marina didn't trust it. She knew these people weren't finished, but neither was she. They had expected her to fold, to step back quietly, perhaps sell the house, leave with a story about the unfriendly lake people. What they hadn't anticipated was that she had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. Not reckless, just resolved, and that resolve was only sharpening. Marina had spent the last few weeks moving from one defensive maneuver to another, like a chess player who'd entered the game halfway through and was still trying to understand the board. Yet, for all the maneuvering, there was one thing she hadn't done. She hadn't taken the fight to them. That changed the day she received a letter from the county assessor's office. It was a formal notification of a pending review of her property's water usage classification. According to the document, a request had been filed to reevaluate her land's status as a multi-use residential parcel, citing evidence of environmental disturbance and unauthorized dock expansion. Marina read the language 3 times, her pulse steady but her mind already moving. The complaint had been submitted anonymously, but the wording was too specific to be coincidence, the timing too precise. It had come just days after she sent her consultant's report. Someone was trying to reverse engineer a regulatory weapon. The dock had not been expanded. It had been reinforced, legally with permits by contractors who logged their work through the county permit system. The environmental disturbance claim was vague, undefined, and as far as Marina could tell, fictional. But if it triggered a reassessment, it could complicate her water rights, potentially stripping her of exclusive usage if the lake were reclassified as shared common property. It was an ambitious move, and it meant whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to make her uncomfortable. They were trying to sever her from the water entirely. She didn't panic. She activated. First, she requested the original submission through the Freedom of Information Act, which, though slow, would eventually reveal the complaint's source. Second, she hired a land use attorney, someone local, someone who had previously handled rural zoning issues and had a working relationship with the County Planning Commission. His name was Arthur Glaive, a quiet, gray-suited man with a methodical tone and a complete aversion to small talk. Marina appreciated that. Arthur reviewed the documents, looked over her permit history, then leaned back and said, "You're clean, but they're looking to confuse the record. If the reassessment gains momentum, it doesn't matter that you're right. It matters how long they can keep you in procedural limbo." Marina nodded. "Can we stop it before it starts?" Arthur tapped the folder. "We can challenge the request with an injunction, but we'll need more than just your consultant's report. We need precedent, cases where usage was upheld under similar conditions." Marina didn't hesitate. "Find them. I'll pay whatever it takes." That night she walked down to the dock and stood on the edge, looking out at the dark expanse of the lake, the moon reflected in thin, fractured lines, the water still, deceptive in its quiet. It didn't feel like hers anymore, not because she doubted her rights, but because every moment of connection had been infected by interference. What had once been a refuge had become a contested zone. Every ripple a reminder that someone was watching, waiting for her to misstep. But that same someone had now made theirs. A bold, traceable move through a government channel. And Marina had no intention of letting that gift go to waste. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur filed the injunction and submitted Marina's documentation to the assessor's office with a formal motion to dismiss the reassessment request as unfounded and procedurally irregular. In parallel, Marina directed her environmental consultant to publish a summary of the findings to the regional planning database, effectively making the assessment part of the public record. Transparency, she knew, was a weapon, too, one that undermined quiet sabotage. While the legal processes churned, something shifted in the community. People who had previously avoided eye contact began offering short nods again. One man even stopped at her mailbox and said, "Heard you're giving them hell. About time someone did." Marina didn't ask who them was. She didn't have to. The narrative was changing, not because she'd shouted louder, but because she hadn't flinched. In communities like Lakeview, perception was currency, and silence was often mistaken for weakness. But Marina had made hers tactical. Then, unexpectedly, Elaine returned, not in the form of a letter or a whisper campaign, but in person. It was late afternoon, and Marina was unloading groceries from her car when she saw the familiar figure walking slowly up the gravel path, arms crossed, expression tight. Marina didn't pause. She set the bag down, turned, and waited. Elaine stopped at the edge of the driveway, not stepping onto the property but standing close enough to make her presence known. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she said, her voice without its usual condescension. Marina raised an eyebrow. "Why? Because I didn't roll over?" Elaine looked toward the lake. "Most people don't last this long. It gets tiring, always having to push back. At some point, it just seems easier to leave." Marina crossed her arms. "I didn't come here to make friends. I came to live on land I legally own, and I'm not going anywhere." Elaine studied her for a long moment, then said, "You think this is about you, about the jet ski. It's not. It's about what comes next. One exception becomes 5. 5 becomes 30. Then the lake changes, and the people change with it. We're trying to preserve something." Marina shook her head. "You're trying to preserve control. That's not the same thing." Elaine didn't argue. She just turned and walked away, disappearing down the path without another word. But the conversation left Marina unsettled, not because Elaine had threatened her, but because she hadn't. There was no smugness, no thinly veiled ultimatum, just a warning, framed in the language of inevitability. And it made Marina realize that whatever was happening here wasn't just petty resistance. It was part of a long-standing cultural preservation, one where newcomers weren't just disliked, they were filtered, slowly, persistently, and through any available system. But Marina didn't come from a world where pressure meant permission, and now she had what she needed, confirmation that the conflict wasn't about behavior. It was about presence, her refusal to defer. That understanding changed everything. It turned the fight from defensive to proactive. She began documenting not just violations against her, but patterns of selective enforcement across the lake. With the help of Arthur, she compiled a dossier. Whose docks exceeded limits, whose boats created excessive wake, which homes had shoreline modifications without permits. Not to punish, but to demonstrate the hypocrisy, the selective focus, the unequal scrutiny. And when she delivered that dossier to the County Ethics Review Board alongside her legal case, she did so not as a victim, but as a stakeholder. The submission was received without commentary, but Marina knew it had been read. The next reassessment hearing was postponed. The complaint retracted. No explanation given. But Marina understood the silence for what it was. Not a retreat, but a recalibration. They would try again, but so would she. Marina had anticipated that the conflict would escalate again. She simply had hoped it wouldn't feel so personal. Her defenses were in place. Cameras, lighting, lawyers, environmental reports. But none of that could insulate her from the realization that she was being targeted not because of what she did, but because of who she was. It crystallized one morning when she came down to the dock for her customary sunrise ride and discovered that the jet ski was missing. The water was calm and empty where its familiar hull should have glided across the mirror-like surface, and the dock was littered with footprints that crisscrossed like an unwritten code. She inspected the chain lock, still taut and fastened, as if someone had simply lifted the craft over the railing and carried it off. The swirling current had left no evidence. She noted the time, 5:17 a.m., and immediately retrieved the security camera footage. It revealed a figure cloaked in shadow, moving with unsettling purpose, lifting the jet ski and carrying it away. It was familiar posture, as if someone accustomed to the work had done it with practiced ease. Marina froze the video on the figure's stance, broad shoulders, confident gait, and stored every frame. Then she called the sheriff's office. By the time the deputy arrived, Marina had prepared an incident report with timestamps, screenshots, footage, metadata, and a link to the encrypted backup she shared with both her attorney, Tessa, and her land use counsel, Arthur. The deputy interviewed her methodically, his notepad clicking in the cool morning air. Marina felt her pulse steady, not with fear, but with focus. She wasn't pleading. She was documenting. Outside, the lake continued to reflect the rising sun without regard for the panic it had just witnessed. The sheriff confirmed they would open a theft investigation, but cautioned that unless the jet ski was recovered or someone came forward, it might be categorized as a civil matter. Marina thanked him and arranged immediately for a replacement jet ski to be delivered under insurance coverage, insisting casually in front of the deputy that she would be back on the lake by the weekend. But privately, she knew that the act, swift, silent, unchallenged, was a deliberate escalation. It was meant to remind her that no matter the data, no matter the reports, she could still be silenced by removal. It was also a message. The stolen craft was just the beginning. That afternoon, a UPS box arrived, a small, tamper-evident envelope containing 5 pages of maps, aerial photos, and handwritten notes documenting Marina's shoreline and boat access, peppered with questions. Who authorized this? On what authority? Do you claim this line? Will the lake users abide by this decision? The tone was less threatening, more inquisitive, as if someone wanted her to prove her right so they could challenge it. Marina scanned the contents and forwarded them, along with timestamps and her own boundary documentation, to Tessa and Arthur with the note. They're mapping everything, including me. By the time sunset colored the lake a bruised purple, Marina received word that the jet ski had been found, dumped on the far shore, half submerged, engine fried by saltwater immersion. The deputy called sheathing sympathy and political neutrality. Looks like someone wanted to slow you down but didn't plan the disposal. Marina responded with calm acknowledgement. She had already arranged for a marine mechanic to tow it, drain the system, and transport it back to her dock for diagnostics. She also contacted her insurance adjuster to expedite a full property review and equipment replacement. But beneath the logistics, she felt the familiar hum of adversity. People don't take pets away when they want to build trust. Later that week, the second assault materialized within the structure of bureaucracy. Marina received a certified letter from the Lakeview Community Council, on proper letterhead this time, stamped Official Notice. Inside, in all capital formal, font was the declaration that her jet ski usage had now been classified as an ongoing threat to water safety, and under community bylaws, which she had never signed, she was subject to fines up to $1,500 per incident and restricted lake access, pending safety recertification. The letter demanded that she appear at a scheduled meeting to explain her actions and threatened to escalate to revocation of lake privileges if she failed to attend. There was an enclosed form to sign and return, and a note about attaching medical or professional documentation to support her case. Marina sat with the letter for a moment, absorbing the layers. Again, language framed as procedure, intention veiled in administrative necessity. Nothing about her property rights, nothing about deed or ownership. Just process, intended to wear her down. She called Tessa immediately, told her the contents, and asked whether attending would lend legitimacy to a fraudulent system. Tessa replied firmly, "Do not legitimize it. Send a refusal to participate unless they produce a legally binding title for your water rights. Then either file a declaratory judgment or ignore." A few minutes later, Arthur called with parallel advice. "This is harassment cloaked in due process. We need to issue a motion for declaratory relief and a temporary restraining order against enforcement of these bylaws against you." Marina requested drafts by end of day, and by the next morning she had forwarded signed motions and legal motions to the county court and served copies to the community council's address via certified mail. That same evening, as Marina finalized the paperwork, she felt something out of sync in her vision. From the deck, the lake appeared foreboding, as if it had silently sensed what was to come. It was a psychological moment that slipped past the logic of her mind and planted itself firmly in her chest. This was no longer about boundary lines in water or procedural sabotage. This was about power, extraction, and the lengths people would go to maintain either. The next day, a heavy snowfall, but it was June and illogical, fell across the community. Marina learned later that the snow had been generated by cloud seeding, authorized by an adjacent county as an experiment. But hearing it, she felt as though her surroundings were conspiring. She joked about it when her attorney asked if she was okay. She told him she'd document the weather as well as everything else. But inside, she knew. The escalation had entered a new realm. From sabotage and smuggling came bureaucracy weaponized. From bureaucracy would come litigation. And from litigation would come revelation. She had no illusions about where this path might end, but she also had no intention of letting them write the final chapter in that direction, because this time she wouldn't only be responding, she would be driving. By the time Marina received confirmation that the court had accepted the motion for declaratory relief, she had stopped expecting the process to feel like a victory. It was necessary, procedural. One more stone she had to stack on a wall meant to keep something corrosive out. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the opposition would respond to losing control. Within 48 hours of the filing, she was served with a formal counterclaim from the Lakeview Council, alleging disruption of community harmony, unauthorized occupation of aquatic territory, and refusal to participate in the cooperative compliance process. Marina read it like she read every other manufactured document, methodically, without panic, extracting the language like a surgeon pulling glass from skin. The counterclaim was weak, resting entirely on their invented bylaws and ignoring her legal deed, recorded title, and environmental assessments. But it didn't matter that it was weak. It was designed to delay, to escalate cost, to erode her patience until the path of least resistance was surrender. The council had hired their own attorney, a woman named Meredith Blackwell, known locally for defending gated communities and restrictive covenant regimes. Blackwell's opening response, published in the county docket, was filled with moralistic prose about preserving generational stewardship and rebalancing use of shared environmental resources. The words property rights appeared only once, when referencing their desire to reevaluate them. Arthur, calm and efficient as ever, called Marina late that night. They're not just trying to win, they're trying to institutionalize their pressure. He paused, then added, "We go public, not press, just records. Let's unseal the original deed, the purchase history, the zoning committee's minutes. Everything. We make your ownership not just legal, but undeniably visible." Marina agreed, and within 24 hours, every relevant document was uploaded to the county's public record database under a cross-reference tag. It wasn't showmanship. It was sunlight, direct, searing, and cleansing. But the real confrontation came not in court or in writing. It came on a warm Thursday morning, 2 weeks later, when Marina answered a knock at her door and found Elaine standing there, not alone, but flanked by 2 members of the council, including Russell. All 3 looked like people arriving to offer condolences, except none of their faces showed sympathy. Elaine spoke first, her voice composed, her hands folded in front of her like someone leading a prayer. "We'd like to request a private meeting. No agenda. Just clarity." Marina stared at them for a long moment before replying. "There's nothing private left. You've made sure of that." Russell stepped forward slightly. We understand you feel wronged. Oh, but we're here as neighbors, not representatives. It doesn't have to end in court." Marina tilted her head. "You already made that choice, and it will end exactly where you drove it." Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly, her composure tightening. "If you're determined to fight, then so be it. But you should know, the lake is changing. Legally, politically, new development interests are reviewing the land. If you remain hostile, you'll be isolated when it counts." Marina smiled, not because she found the moment humorous, but because the threat was so thinly veiled it didn't even qualify as subtext. "I'm not hostile," she replied. "I'm accurate. And I'm not isolated. I'm documented." She stepped back and closed the door without another word. Inside, she locked it calmly, then made a call to Arthur. "We need to expedite discovery, and I want full review of their community budget, past 5 years. What they uncovered wasn't criminal, but it was deeply compromising. Invoices for shoreline maintenance paid to relatives of council members, discretionary spending approved without resident vote, and a conveniently deleted section of the 2003 community plan that removed individual property boundaries from a previous survey. With this information, Arthur filed an amended complaint, now accusing the council of selective enforcement, financial obfuscation, and material misrepresentation of community standards. He attached Marina's full ownership documentation, environmental reports, expert testimony, and declarations from 3 neighbors who had come forward, albeit cautiously, to confirm that similar pressure had been applied to them in years past. The court date was set within days. The hearing room wasn't dramatic, a small, windowless annex in the county courthouse, but the atmosphere was charged. Marina wore a simple black blazer, no makeup, her expression neutral but unwavering. Across from her, Elaine sat rigidly, flanked by Russell and their lawyer, the latter rifling through papers with performative calm. When the judge entered, silence fell. Arthur presented Marina's case cleanly, highlighting the legal ownership of water rights, the improper attempts to restrict access, and the pattern of coercion masked as governance. He introduced the footage of the jet ski theft, the drone surveillance, the altered buoy, and the anonymous mailings. He read the excerpts of bylaws that had been retroactively applied and showed the court a map of community parcels, noting how Marina's was the only one whose boundaries included independent aquatic rights. Then he handed over the invoice records, carefully labeled, revealing conflicts of interest that suggested the council's interest in control was not entirely about stewardship. The opposing council's response was defensive and scattered. Blackwell tried to pivot the issue toward community trust and long-standing culture, but the judge interrupted twice to ask for legal definitions of terms they couldn't substantiate. When Marina took the stand, she didn't deliver a speech. She answered with clarity, restraint, and specificity. "I bought a home with access to water that I legally own. I reinforced my dock with permits. I operated a licensed vehicle on that water. I was harassed, surveilled, threatened, and lied to. I've responded through legal channels only." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't have to. Truth needs no amplification. By the time the judge delivered his opinion, the tension had become suffocating. He ruled in Marina's favor, declaring that her property rights had been repeatedly and improperly challenged by individuals acting outside their legal purview, and that no council, formal or informal, could supersede recorded deeds without express legal authority. He issued an injunction barring the community council from interfering with Marina's property and, more pointedly, ordered a financial audit of their governance practices for the past 10 years. Marina didn't smile. She exhaled, nodded, and stood. Outside the courthouse, she didn't speak to the few onlookers from the community who had come, nor to the local journalist who had been tipped off by someone else. She simply walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and closed her eyes for a full minute. She wasn't thinking of revenge, or triumph, or even relief. She was thinking of the water, how still it had been the day she arrived and how different it looked now, not because it had changed, but because she had been forced to see it differently. It was no longer just scenery. It was a battle line, and she had held it. Marina didn't celebrate the ruling. There were no drinks, no toasts, no phone calls to gloat. The victory, if it could be called that, had been carved from weeks of erosion. Emotional, financial, social. And yet, she hadn't lost anything essential. She still owned her home. She still held her rights. The water, for all its tension, still mirrored the sky without judgment. But something within the community had irrevocably shifted. People began speaking her name again, but not in whispers. A man who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped her one morning while she was pruning the edge of her garden. He didn't introduce himself. He just nodded at her and said, "That was a long time coming," and then walked off. Another neighbor left a small note in her mailbox that read, "We were waiting for someone to stand up." Thank you. No signature, just simple ink on plain paper. Marina folded it and placed it in her filing cabinet alongside the declarations, the court orders, and the old, useless bylaws. It was the only document that didn't need to be notarized. Elaine disappeared from public view for a while. Her name was removed from the community bulletin. Russell stepped down from his position, citing family obligations, and the council was temporarily dissolved pending an external review. The audit began quietly, but its findings, when released, caused a soft implosion. Mishandled funds, back-channel contracts, and years of policy manipulation disguised as consensus. No arrests were made. This wasn't the kind of corruption that screamed in headlines. It was quieter than that. Disappointment dressed as governance. Marina didn't attend the council meetings that followed. She didn't volunteer for reorganization. She didn't lobby for a seat. She simply returned to the rhythm she had built before the war over the water began. Mornings on the deck. Coffee with stillness. A jet ski ride twice a week, not because she needed the thrill, but because claiming space sometimes means using it, unapologetically. One evening, months after the ruling, Marina stood at the edge of her dock and looked out across the lake. The sun was folding into the horizon, and the surface was calm, undisturbed, vast. A pair of kayakers passed in the distance, waved politely, and she returned the gesture without hesitation. There were no letters taped to her door now, no drones buzzing overhead, no figures lurking behind the tree line. But the memory of those moments remained, not as trauma, but as instruction. She had learned what a challenge to belonging looked like and, more importantly, how to meet it with structure, not vengeance. She thought briefly of Elaine, not with bitterness, but with clarity. There would always be people like her, gatekeepers who used etiquette as a weapon, who built mazes around simplicity just to prove they could hold a key. But Marina had learned to read their patterns and dismantle them, not with rebellion, but with precision. She had forced transparency where opacity was power. That was the true victory. Inside her home, the walls no longer felt defensive. The silence was no longer suspicious. She walked from room to room freely, without glancing at the windows, without checking the cameras obsessively. The system remained in place, recording, secure. But she didn't need to monitor it anymore. It existed like the lock on a door, not out of fear, but principle. She sat at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began drafting a letter. Not to a lawyer, not to a court, but to herself. A record of how things had unfolded, a timeline of every escalation and how she met it. A testament not to the chaos, but to her clarity. Because when people talk about resilience, they rarely speak of structure. But Marina had survived because she built her response like scaffolding, Measured, reinforced, impossible to collapse. And in that architecture, she had found peace. The lake didn't change. But Marina had. She was no longer someone retreating into quiet. She was someone who had held her ground and knew, beyond question, that she had the right to stay. And that made all the difference.